So, Asha, are Republican conspiracy theories finally coming home to roost?
It's complicated.
I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
I'm Eliot Higgins. I'm the founder and creative director of Bellingcat, and I specialize in open source investigation.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a skeet. Well, thank you for joining us, Eliot. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have Eliot. I've been following him for a while on Blue Sky, and I got to hear him speak at the Cambridge Disinformation Summit about disordered discourse. And he understands this entire world of disinformation and how it impacts people, and really excited to talk to him about this latest development in MAGA world.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Eliot, this last development has been really interesting because for years, folks on the right have been convinced that there is a vast conspiracy of really Democratic politicians who are hiding the truth about Epstein because they themselves are on a list of clients of Epstein. And right now, now that the Trump administration is trying to dissuade their own followers of this, it seems like it's tearing the MAGA world apart. There's like a civil war right now on X, where they're fighting one another over the Epstein conspiracy theories.
I think one way to think of this is really Trump has brought together a coalition of really what I call disordered counterpublics. So a counterpublic is an idea that Nancy Fraser presented, explaining that, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement in the 70s, they formed what were called counterpublics to react against that, where they created functions that they weren't being served within the main democratic public. But my argument is you can have what I call these disordered counterpublics. These are counterpublics that are engaging in discourse that's fueled by drivers that are really based around a range of things, but really deep distrust in institutions. And people build entire worlds around this. And what you really have in this kind of big tent kind of MAGA movement are actually lots of different counterpublics with different, ways of approaching subjects. They all share a distrust of institutions, but it's not always for the same reason. Usually they've kind of formed on their own, and then they see Trump as a way to kind of achieve their goals. And in one case, there's the kind of Epstein conspiracy theorists who really saw Trump as a way to expose what was going on. And now they feel betrayed because what's happened is a memo's been released by the FBI. It says, he did kill himself. There's no client list. And in the view of this particular counterpublic, there's an absolute betrayal of why they voted for Trump in the first place. But it should be understood that this doesn't represent the entire MAGA movement, but you need to actually look at how that movement is organized. It's kind of like RFK Jr. has his own kind of community around him. Tulsa Gabbard also has communities. And it's not always the same community. Sometimes it's a set of overlapping communities. So there's certainly, with Tulsa Gabbard, for example, a lot of support from the kind of anti-imperialist far left, but also the anti-interventionist far right as well. And they kind of see her as a representative of that. And of course, you've had now the bombing of Iran and her changing of opinion on the intelligence around Iran's nuclear program. And now you've also had this thing with Trump and Ukraine and releasing the weapons, which another group of the MAGA coalition is unhappy about. So all of this is being seen as betrayals, because when you're involved in this disordered discourse, basically a set of kind of almost moral values are created within those communities. And you're the in-group, and anyone outside of that group are either fools or liars. And therefore, anyone who's betraying you from the in-group has to be externalized and attacked. But it's complicated by the fact that, Trump is president. He's not just some kind of fringe figure. He's someone with real power in the institutions that he's supposed to be either bringing down or fixing. But in their views, he's continued to just let them go on with the problems that they've had that formed these disordered counterpublics in the first place.
I love that you distill that there are a lot of different threads going on, because I do think that we have a tendency to ascribe kind of a monolithic ideology to all of them. But as you noted, there's sort of the Epstein conspiracy theorists, there's the anti-vaxxers. As a former intelligence person, I get that horseshoe attack from the Tulsi Gabbard people who all hate, the intelligence, folks and stuff. So I have a question on like kind of getting into the weeds, just so we understand what the narrative is. And I'm guessing that you know these narratives more than I do. The Epstein thing. So the theory, the conspiracy theory is, just so that I'm following, that he was murdered in prison by
unknown forces, but probably Democratic forces. Yeah,
Democratic forces. Okay, yeah. And this was done in order to bury, or kind of prevent him from revealing the names of Democrats who were involved in this whatever global pedophile ring or his own.
It's effectively that, and the big part of this is this client list. Pam Bondi gave this interview where she said it was on her desk, and now she's saying, no, I meant the file was on my desk. I didn't really mean that. Of course, to the people who truly believe this client list existed, who's part of this disordered discourse, that's seen as Pam Bondi betraying them and siding with the paedophiles, effectively. And we also have to look back at I feel like it was a few weeks ago. It could be days, it could be months. You never know with this kind of constant stream. But Elon Musk talking about Trump being in the Epstein files, which kind of really riled those people up. So I think within that community, they feel betrayed. They see Elon Musk making these claims. Suddenly this list they know existed has disappeared. Pam Bondi appears to be changing her story. Trump just gave that press conference responding to this, saying, why are we still going on about Epstein? All of that, in the eyes of these people, comes across as highly suspicious. And that's because their entire worldview, their entire information system is built around reinforcing the idea that Epstein was behind this huge cabal of pedophiles who, were people in power. He was blackmailing them. They were trying to cover it up. And this creates a fracture. And the thing with the MAGA movement at the moment is all about loyalty tests. Are you loyal to Trump? The problem is when you have lots of this coalition of disordered discourses, disordered counterpublics, they're loyal to their own discourse, their own values within that. They just see Trump as a kind of medium to reach their ultimate goal. So when you have these betrayals, it's the question of where do they go next?
This really, it's very interesting. One thing that I'm curious about is, are there elements of this? A lot of times conspiracy theories have elements in which they correspond to reality. One thing about Trump that's been interesting is, I still recall an interview that he gave on Fox where he said, will you release the JFK files? Will you release, all these other files? Yes, yes, yes. What about Epstein files? Well, there's a lot of people who are innocent who are caught up in that and so forth. There's definitely been some element of a reluctance on his part to fully release information about that case. And while there's no client list. I saw some postings by Julie Brown, who was the investigative journalist who originally uncovered the Epstein story and really brought a lot of attention to this story. I believe she won the Pulitzer Prize for that. And she said that while there's no client list, there are FBI reports that contain the names of clients, and they have not been fully unredacted, and those names aren't fully public. Is there something to the fact that Trump is not himself not fully permitting disclosure about this case?
Well, the way I see it, it's It's more the question of whether or not you trust Trump to actually give a fair account of what's actually happening. And I don't think a single person who's interested in this in the entire world probably trusts him to do that. I mean, people either consider him a liar because they come from a kind of the more kind of maybe Democrat left moderate perspective, or that they believe he's covering up an elite cabal of pedophiles, which are two different groups, but they both have reasons to distrust Trump. Or it's almost as if the way I kind of look at this is in democracies, we put our trust in institutions to deliver certain core functions of democracy. And I'm not talking about voting, but kind of really basic ideas. I define them as verification, deliberation, and accountability. So verification is the idea that we have processes and institutions that help find the truth, use organizations through editorial control, the scientific method being used by academics. Deliberation is that we have space to discuss these things, and accountability is that the powerful can be held to account and action can be taken on these ideas. Over the years, people have lost trust in that for various reasons, but they then look for alternative kind of sources of authority to actually kind of establish those three pillars for them. So Trump has become that for many people. They trust him, they believe in him, and that they believe he's going to hold the powerful to account. So what these people are now seeing, who believe that Epstein was definitely a pedophile and was assassinated, are now seeing him fail on those terms as well. So the institutions have betrayed them, and now the person replacing those institutions in their world has also betrayed them.
So basically, he was supposed to be outside of this whole system, and now they're seeing him as part of the system, essentially. Like he's not the outsider that's going to, pull the curtain back.
Yeah, so what we'll also see now are kind of like a filtering of that community between the people who are more loyal to Trump and more people who are more loyal to the community's kind of original kind of beef with Epstein. So that this kind of filtering always happens across these communities, because you can't be, when there's those contradictions, you have to pass a loyalty test, because inevitably, if you don't, you'll be attacked and externalized. It's kind of what happened with Tulsi Gabbard. She went through a very rocky period because she was, as everyone knows, opposed to military action. She had said that Iran hadn't produced nuclear material. And she had to make a choice between her loyalty to Trump and her loyalty to her community. So she made a choice to be loyal to Trump, which felt like a big betrayal through a lot of the people who supported her from those kind of far left and far right positions. I'd also say when we're talking about far left and far right, I kind of prefer to think of it rather in terms of people who are kind of engaged with what I would call democratic discourse, which is based around those ideals of verification, deliberation, accountability, and those people involved with disordered discourse. Because left and right really becomes irrelevant in that circumstance. And that kind of explains for me why we see this kind of horseshoe thing so many people observe. It's really about that kind of emergent disordered discourse that kind of can unify them across the political spectrum, because they think, Assad didn't use chemical weapons, or Epstein didn't kill himself, or whatever their preferred story is.
It's interesting. What is it that Trump says and does that attracts so many conspiracy theorists? Is divergent from people who are following RFK Jr. and believe that, have all sorts of beliefs about science and medicine that are, do not correspond to facts, to people who believe, let's say, the Epstein conspiracy theories.
I think simply it's that you have all these groups who fundamentally don't trust institutions for various reasons. And they see Trump as someone who's going to kind of bring down these institutions and expose them. And that's basically the promise he's making. But those are completely empty promises. He's just saying what he needs to get these different groups on board. And that, I think, is very much influenced by his advisors, the people around him. I think that's why we're seeing a big difference between the last Trump presidency, where you had at least some sensible people, and now the new one, which is just filled with loyalists who have all their own personal agendas and communities, but they've declared loyalty to Trump because they see that as a way of accessing the power they need to achieve the goals of their community. But when the kind of theories of the community meet reality and they can't do that, they become then almost the figurehead for that failure, even before Trump.
So, Eliot, what is different about this particular, the way that this is unfolded, in terms of how conspiracy theories often operate, which is that it does seem that in certain narratives that the people who believe in them, they reconcile, you said there's competing loyalties, right? Like the loyalty to Trump, the loyalty to the narrative, that they will reconcile them by deciding that it's all part of the plan. So we see that, for example, with like the QAnon, like, oh, he has to say that because, he's secretly publishing it in some manifesto that's going to be, delivered in 2 months. In other words, this seems like there is no attempt to do that in this particular instance. And I'm curious why. Is it just because he's not doing the wink and a nod that he normally does? Or is it the Musk fracture that's sort of helping to fuel sort of a taking sides versus trying to integrate, his denial into a non-denial or something?
I think it's part. Yeah, I think it's just in this case in particular, they said they have evidence. Pam Bondi saying the client list is on my desk, and then reversing that position completely. It's not like some 4chan poster making a vague claim about a Q drop. It's someone in the exact position of power they need someone in to reveal the truth, coming out and not revealing the truth in their view. And that's not something you can kind of get around. It's like, why is Pam Bondi betraying us? Mm-hmm. Either she's, was part of the plot all along, she's been compromised somehow. I don't know, maybe she's Jeffrey Epstein wearing a mask, who knows? But they're going to be trying to figure that out among themselves. But they aren't, like, their options for actually getting to the truth have suddenly vanished. This is it. This was their moment, and it's gone. It's been snatched away from them by the people who were supposed to achieve this for them. And that's why I think it comes across as such a huge betrayal. Certainly, I would say more to an extent that, for example, Tulsi Gabbard, you can kind of excuse that a bit from these communities that are kind of anti-interventionists, saying, well, she has to kind of play the game now. She's in these positions. It's not like she's covering up stuff like Pam Bondi is, who is, in the view of these communities, involved now in the cover-up. She's as much as part of this as Hillary Clinton is now.
It's interesting. I mean, one of the things that, of course, marks the Attorney General is that she is not precise with her language. I mean, in other words, generally speaking, lawyers at the Justice Department are very careful about what they say because the words that they use have impact because they can ultimately be cited against the United States Department of Justice in court. So typically anything said by the Attorney General of the United States would be very carefully vetted. But the current Attorney General definitely shoots from the hip, is on Fox News just saying all sorts of things all the time. And here, this seems to be a time where saying something that was politically expedient at the time has created some issues for the administration. I mean, it seems to me that people like Pam Bondi, Tulsi Gabbard, who you've mentioned before, and others, are used to saying things and not being held to account about the details of what they say. And there's a difference between being in power or being a pundit on Fox News.
I think, again, this is a kind of an emergent factor of disordered discourse, because in those systems, accountability is always about the out-group. It never affects the in-group. If you're wrong, they kind of forgive you. As long as you're loyal, you can move on to the next thing and start ranting about that. So because these people come from these communities, that's just the way they've learned to operate. And, there's certainly no accountability anywhere to be seen in the Trump White House. So they don't really have to worry about anything apart from being loyal to Trump. That's the only form of accountability, loyalty tests all the way down. I mean, you're seeing this all over the place throughout the entire US political system at the moment. And it's really about filtering out the disloyal, defining the out group, and making sure everyone within the group are faithful. That doesn't necessarily even mean that they have to believe in the in-group's beliefs. I'm sure the Republican Party at the moment aren't full of House and Senate members who believe all the conspiracy theories and ideas Trump puts out, but they also know that if they push back against it, they'll be seen as disloyal, attacked, and pushed out of the group. So I think this is really just about them not expecting to be held to account in the normal way and understanding it's only really about loyalty tests. And Pam Bondi is not going to talk against Trump in any way whatsoever.
So let's talk about Musk and where he fits into this narrative, because he's obviously adding fuel to the fire, and there is sort of an adjacent loyalty test happening there as well, which is you have this rift between the bromance is over, and then he's using the Epstein files as a way to kind of say, these people know the truth, they're not revealing it. Though it's interesting because then I saw people saying to Musk, well, you know the truth because you say that you've seen it all. So what's the truth? In other words, it seems like a no-win for anyone here. But I'm curious what your take is on that front.
Yeah, I think Musk isn't a leader in this discourse. He is really just trying to kind of get his revenge on Trump to a certain extent, but his statements aren't about leading kind of a community or being part of disordered discourse. It just fuels that discourse. He hasn't made the decision to turn into a full kind of Epstein pilled, suicide truth or whatever they like to call themselves. So I expect you'll see him actually jump around several topics that he's angry about with regards to MAGA and Trump, but not really commit to anything. It's kind of like this America Party that he's, supposedly founded now. I mean, it's a party with no purpose. It's just let's have MAGA without MAGA. I mean, I don't know what he's trying to achieve for that party. He certainly hasn't got the charisma or personality like Trump has to actually become a leadership. So he needs to identify someone to partner with that personality he can bankroll to run the party. Otherwise, it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the America Party because third parties in American politics never really last, and it's structural, right? The first past the post system makes it so that the optimal number of parties is generally two parties, not three. There have been times where there have been third party candidates like Ross Perot who had some success. Musk doesn't seem that way. But what is your read on, Musk not only forming that party, but claiming that he's going to be putting money behind Republican candidates? Seems like you're attributing it to personal revenge, but is there this kind of foretelling some sort of rift in the Republican Party where you might have, for example, an opportunist? I mean, we saw Ron DeSantis suggesting to Musk an alternative path to use his money. You use it on state conventions to try to amend the Constitution. But, are there opportunists who might use Musk's money to try to achieve their own ends against Trump and the Republican movement?
Well, I think he's already been taken advantage of by opportunists in the last election. So maybe he's wise to that now and wants to spend his own money in his own way. But at the same time, I don't think he really has a deep enough understanding of the US political system to use that money effectively. So you'll probably see him throwing vast sums of money at specific candidates, but not really thinking about things like down ballot races or other things that actually might have more impact on the political system. He could act as a spoiler in certain swing states, a couple of percent either way can make a huge difference. But Musk is the ultimate money where your mouth is man, because that's really all he's got. So we've got to see where he puts his money, and then we can make an assessment of how serious he is and how much impact he can have.
So, Eliot, what is the end game with something like the Epstein files? We saw, for example, with Fox News and the Dominion voting systems lawsuit, which detailed how initially after the 2020 election, Fox News was trying to temper the claims that the election was rigged, trying to try to report some accurate news and say that Biden had won. They got the backlash, right, from the people who wanted to stay loyal to the narrative. That base began to move to other networks or other channels like Newsmax or more extreme places, so that incentivized Fox News to then adopt the narrative. In other words, you kind of had the inmates running the asylum. They were like, if you're not going to tell us what we want to hear, we're going to leave. What happens, now, right? You have two of the biggest, Pam Bondi, arguably, at least, I don't think was as deep into the Epstein narrative before she became Attorney General, but Kash Patel and Dan Bongino were, and they too are in positions of power. And so what are the options for this administration? Do they have to, is it that they have to backtrack? and find some way, find some off ramp that allows these people to reconcile, or I don't know, fabricate evidence. There's a little bit of the squirrel going on where they just, they've announced investigations into Comey and Brennan. And so, that feels like kind of a let's distract and throw some meat out there that can, is consistent. I'm just curious, or does it just fade away? Do people eventually forgive and say, well, we still need Trump because he's going to, expose these 10 other things? I don't know.
I think when you have these disordered counterpublics, you often have different degrees of kind of radicalization within those groups. So there's going to be a hardcore of people who just care about the Epstein files. They saw Trump as a medium to get hold of them. They've now been betrayed by that, and they aren't going to turn up and vote for Trump. Now, there might be people who are kind of less radical who are like, okay, maybe Trump has some other plan. Maybe it's the whole QAnon thing of him saying, oh, he's got a secret plan to actually figure this out. But I mean, that's pretty hard to justify in this moment. I mean, they're like the dog that caught the car. They got so close to the moment with everyone they wanted in the exact right positions, and still they don't get their answers. I mean, for me, it's going to be a really interesting thing to observe. Like, where do they go? Do they just keep doubling down and down and down on the conspiracy theories? Often that's the case in these groups. I mean, I've studied lots of different communities around things like MH17, Syrian chemical weapons, COVID, and you always see this kind of behavior. It becomes so much part of their personality that they can't turn away from it, because it would basically say, everything I've committed the last few years of my life to was complete nonsense, a lie. I've alienated my friends and family for absolutely nothing. And not many people are willing to admit that. They'd rather just go on internet forums where everyone else is saying, yes, we agree with you. We're equally as angry with what's happened. Now let's keep trying to find out what the truth is.
So we've been talking, you've been talking about disordered counterpublics, and we've been talking a lot about conspiracy theories. It seems to me that there's some connection between the growth of those groups and changes in technology and changes in how we receive information. In other words, if we teleport ourselves back to 1955 or 1960, you have 3 or 4 television networks. You might have some radio stations, but the sources of news, maybe people have access to 1 or 2 newspapers that in their metropolitan area. But there's only limited sources of information. You may not get information about conspiracy theories. But now we have obviously a proliferation of information sources. People can go to, as you suggested a moment ago, a forum where other people who have that same view can congregate and reinforce each other's views. And you have forms of media that drive engagement by pushing information that will attract and titillate the people who could be clicking and viewing that content. In what sense are these groups as a byproduct of technology and changes in technology?
Oh yeah, I think it's a major part of it. It's multiple factors, I would say. Really going back 40 or 50 years, really, if we look at it. The way I frame it is that if you look at the work of Walter Lippmann, who wrote a book in 1922 called Public Opinion that explores how public opinion is formed, he talks about how effectively elite institutions are the filter of reality to the public. The public gets information from newspapers, the media, whatever. It's usually, broadly shared by everyone. There's only so many newspapers, radio stations surfacing your community. And within that, you develop something called a pseudo environment, your understanding of the world, which is incomplete, but it's really the only way you can kind of really understand the world. It's far too big and far too complicated, is what Lippmann said. And that means that these institutions played a really big role in helping people understand the world, understand democracy, and performed functions, those verification, deliberation, and accountability functions in the eye of the public. Now, post-World War I, the public across Europe and the US felt they'd been betrayed by the media, the government. Millions had died. They felt they'd been lied to, which is true. There was a lot of propaganda during the war. But in the UK and US, there were steps taken to really rebuild democracy. There was an expansion of voting rights, a trade union movement, which was a victim of the Red Scare in the US, but more successful in the UK, an expansion of social services. And elsewhere, places like Germany and Italy, you didn't have that. And we all saw where that went. So they built democracy. They rebuilt democracy, and that's what has to be done. Democracy is never perfect. That doesn't mean we abandon it. It means that's a process that we go through. And this is an idea that someone who responded to Lippmann, John Dewey, really put, that, democracy is something that we work on. It's not just something that reaches a state, it's done, and then we can just leave it running like an engine. So we then come to, I think for me, the key period is really, we go through the kind of 60s and 70s with the civil rights movement, the formation of these counterpublics. And for me, counterpublics form an important function in democracy when they operate within those verification, deliberation, and accountability ideals. If they don't, then they turn into disordered counterpublics, which is what we have now. But what happened in kind of the 80s, I think really neoliberalism kind of became the political logic, that the markets support the markets, give everyone lots of freedom to kind of work, start businesses, not pay taxes, and the miracle of democracy will somehow happen out of that. This is a logic that I think informs most Western democracies. But that also meant that a lot of the services that were paid through the taxes, the communities that were necessary for the formation of these health counterpublics kind of just disappeared because there wasn't the money available for them. There wasn't a good market need for having community centers. The media ownership became kind of more kind of centralized. And then we come to 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, and what the public see is those free functions that they assume that the government is responsible for, and the media, the verification of information. We ended up with a dodgy dossier and, false allegations about chemical weapons in Iraq. Deliberation, there was no real debate. It was, you're either with us or against us. And then when it all went terribly wrong, and in the UK we had a huge scandal, there's no real accountability. And that was very, very visible to the public. Even if they don't put it in those terms, in a way I would say the kind of moral meaning of democracy is defined through those free functions. So they saw that fail. 2008 comes along, loads of people lose their houses, but the bankers still get their bonuses. Another betrayal of that kind of social contract that we've got with the kind of middle managers of neoliberalism that most politicians have become by that point. And the problem is the politicians' role in that system is to maintain the status quo and provide us with as much freedom as possible. But what they're talking about is what Berlin defines as negative freedom, freedom from interference, freedom of speech and so on. But what they took away was positive freedom, our freedom too. We kind of handed that away, saying, just keep things running okay, let us be successful. And then, if we work hard, then we become successful. But that didn't really work out. And then the internet comes along, and you then have these platforms, these spaces that allow people to come together and form these kind of new disordered counterpublics where those functions become always simulated on these platforms. Instead of verification, you have the algorithm recommending you stuff that reinforces what you already believe. Instead of deliberation, you just have a constant stream of content being flashed in your eyes, and you don't really have any time for kind of discussion or debate. It's just on to the next thing, something that Steve Bannon learned very early and Trump works with very well. And then accountability just disappears altogether. I say to people, ask yourself 3 questions and to test if your democracy is working. First, can you know the truth? Second, does your voice matter? And 3, can the powerful be held to account? Now, I would ask the 2 of you to answer those 3 questions now. Do you answer yes or no to those questions?
Wait, repeat the 3 questions.
First, can you know the truth in your political system?
Wow, that's a huge question.
It kind of depends on who's in power. I mean, I don't know that I would trust
who's
the truth.
Well, at the moment, we've got Trump saying, "Oh, you can trust me on the Epstein files." Does anyone believe him?
I mean, I guess what I would say, Eliot, is that a lot of this is dependent on process, right? Like, I do believe that you can that there is a way to know the truth if the processes that underlie our institutions are working properly.
Well, are they?
That they are supposed to. They're supposed to be there to provide that verification, right? I mean, when you look at the invasion of Iraq, like that was, the W administration subverted the normal vetting process that should have taken place with regard to that intelligence in order, they basically bypassed it or pressured the people making the intelligence to come up with the claim that they needed. Had that process worked the way that it should have, we would have known the truth. So I think that this is like, are the processes working properly, or is there someone subverting it? So I think you can, but if you have people who are actively subverting the process, as I think might be happening now, then it becomes very difficult.
I also would just say, I mean, it depends on what you mean by the question, right? In other words, is it possible to determine whether vaccines are in fact safe or whether they cause some sort of disease? Yes, it is certainly possible, and there's many scientists around the world who can point to data and give you conclusions that they can draw from that data and their analysis of that. Now, that doesn't mean that our people in our government are going to always make statements in accordance with that data, and it's very possible that our current Secretary of Health and Human Services does not live in a reality-based community, to use a Trump or a Bush era term. But that doesn't mean it's impossible to determine the truth. It just means that there are people who are acting against that.
Eliot is regretting asking these questions to two.
No, it's interesting to hear your response, because this is you're kind of actually revealing the issue here. You're saying, yeah, it does work, except it's not working at the moment. It's kind of the impression I'm getting at the moment, which doesn't sound like a great answer to me if you're trying to say, yeah, democracy is great. Let's look at deliberation, though. So, I mean, obviously, you've got a podcast and you have a voice, but politically, do you think first of all, assuming you can vote in the midterms, do you think that's going to be something where your vote's really going to count that much at that moment? Maybe we need to be closer to the election when maybe there's a lot of ICE officers around polling stations, but, that's the question you also have to examine.
I think, too, so that's one where I will probably push back more strongly. I do think that whether or not the Democrats win the House is going to have a significant impact. I mean, it will matter, because as a practical matter, yes, Trump is treating executive orders as if they're laws, but it's much more difficult to undo a law that's been passed by Congress and signed as a law by the president than it is to undo an executive order. So there is an actual real world impact, and that the thickness of the institution and the Constitution and the structures that are set up there are harder to undo and harder to subvert. And that piece of things still is functioning in a way that matters, in my view.
What about you? How do you feel on that one?
I mean, I think, for sure, a part of the project of, I think, the right has been to neutralize the ability of at least some people to have a voice, right? So it is harder, I would say, if you're looking at just voting. I would say that we have to expand the aperture, that democracy isn't just voting. And I think when you see the massive turnout, for example, with the protests, the pushback by some law firms on these executive orders, I think certain investigative outlets that are really doing, being the fourth estate here. I don't think we are goners, I guess, is what I would say.
I think what's interesting about this is what you're talking about is almost like, how do you form a counterpublic in this situation? Because you're recognizing that the public isn't serving your interests. You're saying, correct. Okay, I'm not sure, deliberation kind of works, but it could work better. The question then is, how do you make it work better? What are the structures you can create?
Yeah, we need a counterpublic.
And then I think the final question, can the powerful be held to account, which may be one of the easiest answers of them all. Can Donald Trump be held to account?
No.
Yeah. So this starts, you need to kind of look at this, not just in terms of, the reason I ask a simple question is to kind of actually have this response that we kind of start thinking about this, actually just break down this question a bit more thoroughly. Because then you start seeing, actually, there are problems, but are those problems insurmountable? I kind of worry Trump being held to account may be one of those, but we have to look at how in our democracies do we rebuild those verification, deliberation, and accountability functions within the public, but also these counterpublics that are starting to form? The problem is social media doesn't allow healthy counterpublics to form. It just reinforces everyone's biases, beliefs. It shares them content that is purely for engagement. I saw this thing after Trump, Grok Grok turned into Mecha Hitler yesterday and went completely insane. It posted that, I'm about truth seeking, and we train on X user data to do that. That has nothing to do with truth seeking. I mean, social media platforms are driven by engagement. That's all this really cares about. It's not about truth seeking. It's about whatever gets the most clicks and most eyeballs on it. And in a democratic system, that's absolutely toxic, because you aren't caring about the truth. But if that's your only platform where there's an attempt to find the truth, then we're in deep, deep trouble, because that's not what those systems are designed to do. So we have to design systems, communities to work on that. But there's no one size fits all solution to this. And I think it really has to start at a local level. Yeah. We've lost local media, that there's a lack of funding for local NGOs that support communities. How do you rebuild that from the ground up? I don't think top-down solutions are going to work, because they're going to be introduced by people who I think are already part of a way of thinking about politics that I don't think really works in the modern era. Our entire information system is transitioning into a new information system. And our political system is based around that old system, and it's not adapting. And this is why it's leaving this space for a rise of authoritarianism. And in fact, I would argue that the inevitable outcome of this is the rise of authoritarianism, without very serious attempts to rebuild those democratic functions.
It's really interesting. You're one of the first people that I've met that actually tries to answer and provide a solution to this. This issue. In other words, I talked a lot to people about disinformation and misinformation, and the impact that has had on our democracy. But I rarely hear anyone offer any sort of solution whatsoever, other than perhaps combating disinformation on one side with disinformation on another, on the other side. And so I commend you for providing some sort of solution, because I certainly on my end have not been able to come up with one.
And I actually love that your idea is that the solution is local, because if you look at, a historical point, at least in the US, where we were in a similar place, maybe not necessarily in terms of the information space, but in terms of like rapid technological change and acute income inequality and xenophobia and all of this kind of stuff, like during the Gilded Age, what really kind of got us out was the progressive era, which was really about organizing. I think some of those would be considered counterpublics, like the suffrage movement and things like that, that were all happening by organizing at the local level. And I think we forget that in many ways for American democracy, we're fortunate that things are decentralized and you can actually do a lot at the local level. But I think we get so sucked into this idea that everything has to change only with, Congress or something.
And you have to really look at democracy as an ongoing project. There's never an end point. There's no perfect democracy, but that's kind of the point of democracy. That if we had a perfect democracy, then it's not a real democracy. We have to leave spaces for there to be healthy disagreement. That democracy isn't about everyone agreeing, it's about coming to a solution that suits the most people as possible. And for me, it really starts at a local level. It's like, how do we restore the local media in a way that's sustainable? How do we connect that to local communities? In the work of Bellingcat at the moment, I'm doing a lot of work in the UK and Netherlands about mapping all of this out, but also practical steps like we go to universities, help them develop open source investigation focused course material, and then help them create investigative hubs, which allow students to investigate issues they care about, both on the national, international, but also the local level. And the idea is to connect those hubs to local media, local communities, NGOs, to offer them the support they may need here and there with that open source capability, but also understand that it isn't about making things at the center of the universe. It's about being, a distributed network, which, we have an entire information system that does that really, really well. We just have to make the most of it instead of just finding people to be mad at on the internet.
I think we should end there, because that is a positive note and we don't get many of those.
At least, yes, for sure, particularly in this topic.
That's great. Thanks for having me on.
So, Asha, before we go, I'm obviously on the road now. Everyone can see that this is not my home. This is a hotel room. But I spent a number of days, as we talked about last week, at my wife's family reunion with, I think, 140 plus family members from all over the place.
Okay.
And one thing I have to say is very interesting, that our last episode was discussed at the family reunion. So I shout out to cousin Ellen from France, who watches every single one of our episodes, is very excited that we're now on the Midas Touch Network, and was very tickled that we discussed the reunion in our last episode. So that was actually very cool, to talk to people who actually are really interested in the podcast.
Oh, wow. So that, I mean, I will say we did not have anyone from France at our reunion, though it was probably about 100 people. What were the highlights?
The entire my wife's the reunion group is the Ruckel and Isaac. I know I'm not Jewish, I can't pronounce it correctly. And Isaac Cousins Club, and Ruckel and Isaac came from some village in Poland, and everybody's a descendant of that. And so they actually have somebody dress and put, like, there's a guy who comes in with like a fake beard as Isaac, and someone who's dressed like Ruchel, and they come in and, like, you get to meet the original
I
people who
love this.
started all. There's a fight song, Ruchel and Isaac fight song. I mean, yeah, it's the whole thing.
Okay, this is fascinating because my reunion is it's actually it's a organization called the North American Sankethi Association, and like your wife, this is all descendants from this one village, and there is also a specific founder of that village, a woman actually, and there is a song.
No kidding.
There is a song in the Sankethi language, which is its own language. So this is this village has its own set of cultures, its language, its cuisine. In fact, we had one meal during the reunion of like on a banana leaf, traditional Sankethi meal on a banana leaf. This is very interesting, the parallels. We do not get to meet, I should know her name, Narchama, as somebody dressed up like her, but I will suggest it.
Yeah, it was a part of a big thing when they came in. I mean, they interviewed them like they had to pretend like they were from this village in Poland from, whatever, 150 years ago. It was something.
Do they do like kind of intergenerational like discussions and stuff? Because I think what was really interesting about mine is that, this kind of group was founded in the 80s by the first generation of Sankethis who had come to the United States. And frankly, initially they created this as a way for like all the descendant, they wanted the kids to get married.
Oh my!
And meet each other, so it's sort of like a matchmaking thing, and that totally failed. I think, except for like one couple that it worked for. But anyway, so in those early years, I remember because I was a child, there was a lot of like we would do skits, and it was all about kind of straddling the American culture and the Sankethi culture and Indian culture. But now you have this next generation. And their whole perspective on it is completely different. And they're a little bit more removed from language and customs and traditions. So many people, like I said, most people have not married other people from this, this clan, if you will. So it's just really interesting to see the generational change.
That's interesting. I mean, one thing that I'm married into this. My wife's family is Jewish. For them, it's very important to preserve traditions and preserve their culture because obviously there have been people who've tried to exterminate that culture. And so it's interesting. There's definitely still a push to do this. There's definitely there's a bit of a divide. I mean, there's some people who are less into this than others. My wife's very into it. Mm-hmm. But it's also started in the 80s, by the way. And this is the
Okay.
40th anniversary.
This was 41st anniversary. Last year we did the 40th.
So they do it every 4 years, this group.
Okay.
So, and it's in a different location. My wife's on the committee to plan the next one in Chicago.
Oh.
So there you go.
I should talk to her because we're looking, always like kind of exploring venues.
Yeah, no, that's a big thing. Finding something that can work cost-wise for the broadest group of
Yeah.
people is important.
Mhm.
Yeah, to make sure. And they move the location every 4 years. They move the location so that this way there's a more local group that can come that can't afford to fly to a different location and that sort of thing.
Wow, this is so interesting. So many parallels,
Absolutely.
I love it.
And it was cool that we're able to have discussion about a lot of these topics, even in the cousins reunion.
Absolutely.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.